In this video, we will be discussing two different two-column proof examples where we will use the multiplication and or division properties. So if we look at our first one, we have three givens, and make sure that you put tick marks on segments PQ and PN since that is given that they are congruent. So we're going to start this proof by copying down those three givens. Okay, now that we have those givens copied down, now we're going to look at what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove that segment PS is congruent to segment PT. Now, since we see the word trisect twice, that's how we know that it's either going to be a multiplication or division property problem. So let me highlight what we're trying to prove here in blue. And since we know that all those points are trisecting those larger segments and the two top segments are congruent, therefore all 6 of those smaller segments must be congruent to each other. So we can go straight to our conclusion and say that segment PS is congruent to segment PT. And since we went from those smaller congruent segments to proving the larger congruent segments, this would be an example of the multiplication property. Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is pause the video here and try example 2 on your own. When you've finished example 2, press play to check your answers. In this second proof, we are given that DB bisects angle ADC, HF bisects angle EHG, and angle ADC is congruent to angle EHG. So make sure you put those tick marks on your diagram. So we'll start this proof again by copying down those 3 givens and then taking a look at what we are trying to prove. We are trying to prove that angle ADB is congruent to angle EHF. So I'm going to highlight those 2 angles here in blue. Now, since we are starting with the larger angles being congruent, and we know that both of those larger angles are being bisected, therefore, those 4 smaller angles must be congruent to each other. So we can go straight to our conclusion and say that angle ADB is congruent to angle EHF by the division property, since we were going from the larger congruent angles to the smaller congruent angles. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to use the multiplication and division properties in two-column proofs.